I'm going to go back this morning to up where we left off 2 weeks ago. And so if you go back with me to the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, and I realize we didn't finish Psalm 23 last week. Maybe we'll pick that back up another time. But some of you know that before I came here, I worked with students for 8 years. And I remember early on one time when we had a student program on a Sunday morning, we played this game where I think it was like finish the line, finish the lyrics, and we did some fun Disney songs. And so I'd have contestants come up on stage and, we'd play the first verse or whatever it was, and we'd stop it abruptly, and they would have to finish the rest of the song, or at least the next line. And what the students didn't realize is that we surprised them, and between services, between his preaching, our pastor, Pastor Davey, actually came over to student ministry, and he was the last contestant. And I have a picture somewhere. I couldn't find it, but I wish I could have put it on the screen for you. So he's all dressed up in his full suit and everything, like he does every Sunday, and he's in between services, and he comes over there, and the song we gave him was Let It Go from Frozen. And it was awesome, because we played, whatever part of the song, then we stopped it, and then he's actually a very musical person, and he's very gifted, and so he sang the rest of Let It Go. And it was great, and the kids loved it, and it was really funny. So we took some pictures of that, and I posted it on our social media. Again, this was years ago. But I posted it on social media with the caption of the goat emoji, okay? And now, GOAT, of course, is an acronym, G-O-A-T, for the greatest of all time. But a lot of people didn't realize that. Again, this is for students. Our students realize that. But I remember having an elder in the church come to me a couple weeks later, and he said, I could not figure out why you guys posted a picture of our senior pastor with a goat emoji. And he just thought it was so rude. And I said, no. It was actually a compliment. It's the greatest of all time. And he's like, oh, I get it. And we think a lot, and there's a lot of debates about the GOAT today in different sporting arenas or whatever domain you have to think about. But what we're going to find today in our text is that the people of Israel had a GOAT. They had a greatest of all time in the lore of Israel's history. And what we're going to see in Hebrews chapter 3 in these first 6 verses is how their GOAT, their greatest of all time, compares to the person and work of Jesus Christ. And we're here today in Hebrews, of course, chapter 3, and many of you are already there, but just by way of review, Hebrews is a letter that's written to Jewish Christians, probably, again, a small house church in Rome, that's undergoing persecution. And this letter is relevant. The reason we're going through it is because it's relevant not just to that church in Rome, but to our church right here in Pofftown in the 21st century. But most of all, what we learn in Hebrews and what we're seeing as we're kind of unpacking this and going through this wonderful letter is that the author, whoever it was, which again, we don't know who it was, but the author of this book really thinks highly of Jesus. And so what we're going to see here this morning in this text is we're going to see a command, we're going to see a comparison, and then we're going to see a condition. A command, a comparison, and then a condition. I want you to notice first the command. Notice in verse 1. He begins by saying, therefore, holy brothers, who share in a heavenly calling. Now again, we'll unpack this as we go through these 6 verses, but let me just stop there for a moment and remind us that this letter is written to believers. It's not necessarily written to those who have not accepted Christ, but the audience, of course, it has implications for all of us, every person in this community. But the immediate context is those who have accepted Jesus. And so he says, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling. What does he mean there by this heavenly calling? Well, the word holy just means set apart. We are set apart for a higher place. We have a higher purpose. That's all of you who are in Christ Jesus. But But notice he says this, and here's the command. He says in verse 1, consider Jesus. Consider Jesus. The original word for consider there is katanaeo. It means to give thoughtful and diligent reflection. We may, sometimes again, we look at this and we would say this to someone who maybe has never accepted Christ, and we would tell them, consider Jesus, and certainly the implication of that is there. But again, it's writing to believers, and so to everyone who's trusted Christ in this room, is saying, hey, I want you to look intently at Jesus. It's been summarized this way. This word has a strong implication that the attention paid is intense, and the contemplation is broad and thorough, resulting in complete understanding. I like how the NIV summarizes this phrase. It says to fix your thoughts on Jesus. We're going to find a parallel passage later on in Hebrews chapter 12. Remember where he says to look to Jesus, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. The idea here is to consider the grace of God in Christ Jesus. Consider his humility. Consider his sacrifice. Consider his grace. Keep that on your mind. Keep it on your mind. And this is a wonderful implication this morning because it tells us that the battle that we all face is a battle for our mind. It's a battle for the mind. Let me read to you Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. You don't have to turn there, but I'll read it for you and remind you this morning that Paul says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world or this age, but be transformed, how? By the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. The renewing of your mind. Consider Jesus. I think if you were to take those two words, you could take those two words, and that would be the summary of this entire book of Hebrews. Consider Jesus. Look, you'll never exhaust the depths and riches of Jesus Christ in your lifetime. There was a one-time consideration upon your accepting of Jesus, but if you're a believer here today, there is an everyday contemplation of Jesus required for us to walk faithfully and follow him. You'll never exhaust the riches of Jesus Christ. We have to make a decision every week. Hey, I'm going to learn more about Jesus this week. I'm going to apply my mind to study the life of Christ this week. The entire reason we had VBS this week was to help kids consider Jesus. They learned all types of things about Jesus, that he was their shepherd, their comforter, their leader, their protector, and Wednesday night, like I talked about, their promise keeper. Consider Jesus. If I wanted to be a successful person in a particular field, I might read some biographies. And I brought some of them here with me this morning. If I wanted to be an enigmatic visionary, I might read this by Steve Jobs. A friend gifted this to me years ago. I haven't made it through, I must confess. But if I wanted to really think like a visionary thought, an eccentric visionary, if you know anything about Steve Jobs, I'd read this book. I'd study what he did. Amazing life. Or if I wanted to be a successful executive, I might read this book, The Ride of a Lifetime. This is a book I read a few years back by Bob Iger, who was at the time the CEO of Walt Disney. And amazing story. He used to work at ABC and then rose in the ranks because of his hard work and effort. And really incredible story, Bob Iger. Or if I wanted to learn about how to be a winning coach, I might read this book here by Roy Williams, one of my favorites. Roy Williams was a coach, of course, of North Carolina Tar Heels, won 3 national championships, but a lot of people don't realize that Roy Williams is from the western part of our state. And I think he grew up in the Asheville area, and just an incredible, I mean, he was I think he was some type of janitor or something that was working in the arena. Dean Smith calls him down, and he became an assistant coach and rose in the rankings. Anyway, great book about hard work and dedication that he applies to his life. If I want to learn how to be a winning coach, though, I might read this book. I've got some other books in my office by John Wooden. I almost brought those out this morning. Some of you remember John Wooden, the winningest coach, I think, as far as championships go in NCAA history, coached the UCLA Bruins. If I wanted to be a successful preacher this morning, though, I might read this, A Prophet with Honor. This is a biography of Billy Graham. And everybody knows the name of Billy Graham, right? But I love studying the life of Billy Graham. I remember seeing a documentary on his life. I think it was CBS years ago when he passed away. And what I would do is, if I wanted to become like these people, I would read after them. I'd study their habits. I'd study their routines. I'd study their lifestyle. Do they wake up at 5 a.m.? And what do they eat? And where do they go to college? Or did they go to college? If I wanted to be great, what I'm saying this morning, and I would study the greats. And let me just say this. If you want to be great at life, you have to study the life of Jesus. You have to study the life of Jesus. Consider Jesus. The implication is to know the person and work of Christ so well that you'll be able to detect what idea or action or habit is Christ-like and what is not. I love what the Anglican pastor J.I. Packer once said. He said this. He said, live slowly enough to think deeply about God. Live slowly enough to think deeply about God. Let His thoughts shape your thoughts. Let His words shape your words. Let His actions shape your actions. Let His habits shape your habits. Friend, let me challenge you this morning to consider Jesus. Contemplate Him. Meditate on Him. Study His life. And he continues here, the author of Hebrews, he continues by telling us that Jesus has two roles. I want you to notice with me at the end of verse 1. Consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession. The apostle and high priest of our confession. What is he saying here? Well, the apostle just means sent one. In other words, Jesus was sent by God to accomplish His purpose. So in that sense, He is our great apostle. There were other apostles, but He's our great apostle. He's also our high priest. That means He's, again, the mediator between us and God. We have a direct connection to God now because we have a mediator, and that mediator is Jesus Christ. This high priest theme is going to be developed later on. We're going to cover that. But the high priest was the highest ranking religious authority in the minds of the Jewish people. And so again, what the author of Hebrews is doing here is, as we can kind of see this, remember he took the angels and he said, hey, Jesus is greater than the angels. And he's just going through the greatest people, whoever is wonderful in the minds of the Jewish people, and he's comparing them to Jesus. But he adds here, the apostle and high priest of our confession. What does he mean by our confession? When we say confession, we think we're confessing something, we're admitting something. When we think of confessing our sins to other people, confessions are polarizing. They prompt a response that raises an eyebrow. Imagine if you were to admit a hidden sin to your spouse, it would probably prompt a strong reaction from them, right? You're confessing something. But what the author has in mind here is not confessing a sin, but it's admitting what we believe about Jesus. It's our confession of faith. It's saying, hey, we believe that what the Bible says about Jesus is actually true. That is our confession of faith. We're admitting that. And by the way, when we admit that, we should expect a strong response because it's a confession. We're drawing a line in the sand and we're saying, hey, this is what I believe. So Jesus, though, is the apostle. He's the sent one, and he's the high priest. He's the mediator of our confession. Notice verse 2. Who was faithful to him who appointed him. Here's the main takeaway for this first point, though, this command. I want to encourage you this morning to make time to consider Jesus. Make time, if you're following along in your notes, make time to consider Jesus. Secondly, not only we see a command, but I want you to notice the comparison. The comparison. Notice he says here, who was faithful to him who appointed him, verse 2, just as Moses was also faithful in all God's house. Now here it is. Here this text, the author introduces not the angels this time, but another legendary figure in the lore of Israel's history, and that is this person, Moses. Moses. Comparison and contrast can be a really powerful rhetorical device. Let me give you an example of a sports comparison this morning. All right, I'm going to put a guy up on the screen. His name was Brian Scalabrine. Now, I'm digging way back, all right? Played for several different teams. And I grew up, and Brian Scalabrine always rode the bench. And he rode the bench for teams that were usually really good. And so I think he has some championships, if I remember. Maybe one of them's with the Celtics. But Brian Scalabrine is kind of famous because years ago, people were mocking Brian Scalabrine. And they were saying, hey, yeah, you're in the NBA, but you ride the bench. In fact, let me read you his career stats, okay? They're not very stellar. Brian Scalabrine, over his career, averaged 3.1 points, 2 rebounds, and 0.8 assists. Not very good, okay? Not very good. And they're really not good when you compare Brian Scalabrine to this next guy I'm going to put on the screen. Some of you may recognize him. Anybody recognize this guy? Yeah? One of North Carolina's greats? Michael Jordan. All right, so Brian Scalabrine averaged 3 points a game. Let me read you Michael Jordan's career stats. 30.1 points a game, 6.2 rebounds, and 5.3 assists. So when you compare these two, you start to realize, yeah, Brian Scalabrine, he may be a punk. But there were a bunch of, again, average people like me mocking him, okay? I didn't mock him. I'm just saying I'm an average basketball player, okay? But there were people online saying, hey, you average 3 points a game. When they compared to people like MJ or other all-stars, you're terrible, you're trash. So you know what was actually funny? Brian Scalabrine, living, I think, in the Boston area at the time, he got fed up with it. And so he said, all right, he was on a radio show, I think. And he said, I'll challenge anybody. Everybody who's saying I'm no good, we're going to play one-on-one. And you know what they did? They met in a park in, I think, again, the Boston area, if I remember this correctly, and he played these average Joes on the street. And the funny thing was, he absolutely humiliated these players. He was dominant. He finished the games, and I don't know what the scores were, but the total score of all the games was 44-6. He killed these guys. What am I saying this morning? I'm saying comparison and contrast can be really powerful. When you compare a guy like Brian Scalabrine to MJ, you're like, yeah, he's no good. But would you compare anybody who plays in the National Basketball Association who sits on the end of the bench to the average person like me, they're really incredible, okay? All right, so where does that bring us to? Well, I like rankings, okay? So I thought it'd be kind of fun this week to put this on the screen. Let's do some biblical rankings of awesome Israelites, okay? And we're going to start down here at the D tier, okay, at the bottom. And if you study some of these people in again, Israel's history, and again, this is all subjective, okay? So I put this together this week. But just based on, I'm looking at the influence in Israel's history, Bible books they wrote, how much of the Bible is dedicated to their life. So if we started down here at the bottom, you have these minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. Those books of the Bible that nobody knows how to find. Look, I have a few Bible degrees, and I still have to look at the contents to even get there, okay? But those guys, they're not minor importance. They're minor because they have smaller books in the Bible. But, this is still, to even be on this chart's amazing. Again, they have a book of the Bible named after them. Incredible, okay? Incredible. But still, they're probably somewhere near the bottom. Let's go up to the C tier, okay? You got guys like Joshua, who has a 24-book Bible named after him, an amazing leader, successor, led the people of Israel to conquer Canaan. An incredible leader, okay? Joshua. I have a brother named Joshua. Some of you know people named Joshua. You may be in here and your name is Joshua. All right? People name other people, children, after people for a reason, because he was a great person, okay? And I might put Elijah and Elisha on this list as well. Again, they were pretty famous, had some pretty incredible stuff happen to them. B tier, all right? You got the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. When you mention Israel's history, that's who you're talking about, right? Those three names together. So incredible there, enough said. And then you got Solomon. Solomon, the wisest person to ever live. Solomon wrote a lot of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Pretty amazing. And then you got the A tier, and this is David. I mean, David is amazing. In fact, the Star of David is on the national flag of Israel today. David, I mean, incredible. How many of you know someone named David? Anybody know someone named David? Okay, anybody in here? Well, we got David in the back, yeah. Okay, anybody else named David in here? Okay, yeah. David, all right? I mean, the warrior poet, wrote so many of the Psalms and so much of the Old Testament is dedicated to him. David, incredible hero. All that to say, why am I trying to set this up? Because at the very top, you have Moses. Moses is the central figure in Israel's history. We could say he's Israel's GOAT. He's their greatest of all time. Moses is the Michael Jordan of Israeli prophets. That's what I'm saying this morning. He's S tier. He is the top. How do we know this? Because so much of the Bible is dedicated to Moses. Moses is incredible. Of course, he wrote the Pentateuch or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. The 10 Commandments were given to Moses. But I just want to read to you Moses' eulogy, which is found in Deuteronomy 34. All right, don't turn there. You can write it down, Deuteronomy 34, 10 through 12. Let me just read this for you. It says, "And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." Moses, the same Moses who parted the Red Sea and led God's people out of Egypt. Did you know, up until the New Testament, when the Israelites will talk about their history, they had this one event that symbolized God's mighty acts in their history of rescuing and deliverance, and it was the Exodus from Egypt. They still celebrated the Passover. To this day, they still celebrate the Passover. You remember what the Passover is, right? When you had, the blood that was put on the door and God passed over by the door and didn't kill the firstborn. You remember that, right? So Moses was the central figure in that because he led the people out of Egypt. Part of the Red Sea, miraculous. He was a rescuer. He was a leader. He led God's people through the wilderness. Again, he was a prophet. He spoke on God's behalf. By the way, Moses was the only prophet to ever see God this side of heaven face to face. The only one. Incredible. He was a lawgiver. Again, he wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He delivered the 10 Commandments. He was a man of character. Numbers 12 verse 3 says, though he was not perfect, he was once called the meekest man on earth in Numbers 12:3. Again, he was the central figure in Israelite history. He was untouchable, incomparable. My guess is that sometime around when the Israelites were delivered from Egypt, there was an uptick in baby boys named Moses. That's my guess. All right, I don't have any data for that, but that's my guess. Moses, incomparable, untouchable. And what the author of Hebrews does, he proceeds to give us 2 reasons that Jesus is greater than Moses. 2 reasons Jesus is superior to Moses. To borrow from Kent Hughes this morning, 1, Jesus is a superior person. He's a superior person. And what he's going to do here is he's going to use 2 images to compare and contrast Jesus and Moses. He's going to talk about Jesus as the builder, Moses as the building, and then he's going to talk about Jesus as the son, Moses as the servant. Okay, Moses as the servant. And we have to ask this before we go any farther, though, Verse 2, back up for a second, it talks about God's house. What is God's house? Well, we're going to get to this in just a moment. This isn't the church building. This is God's people. That's what it's talking about, okay? God's house is God's people, okay? So number 1, Jesus is a superior person. Look with me at verse 3. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses. Worthy of more glory than Moses. Now, what is glory? We all know what glory is. This afternoon, later today, we have the World Cup final where Spain is going to play Argentina. I read this week where the winner of the World Cup final, the team gets, anybody guess how much money they get for the team? Who said that? Yeah, you probably read, $50 million for the team. That's incredible. Split it a few different ways, that's still a lot of money. But let me tell you something. These players are going to play incredibly hard this afternoon, not because of the money. They're already wealthy. What's another $1 million? I'm not saying it doesn't play some role in their effort, but it's not the chief reason. The reason they're going to play this afternoon is for glory. For glory. Glory just means something that's weighty, something that's important, something that's awesome. You can't put a dollar amount on glory. Athletes play to win because winning brings glory. And glory is priceless. And the text here says that Jesus is worthy of more glory, more awesomeness, more importance, more excellence. He's more awesome than Moses. Because again, Moses was a glorious person. And again, what the author here is doing is he's not like saying Moses was bad, just like with the angels. He's not saying the angels were bad, the angels were terrible. He's just saying the angels were amazing. Moses is amazing. But I want you to see this morning that there's someone else that's even better than all of them. And that's Jesus Christ. That's what he's saying here. And he goes back here to this metaphor of a house by introducing Jesus as the builder. Notice verse 3. He's counted more worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. In that era, the builder was considered greater than his building. And it's similar today. One of the things Brittany and I love to do, and we've loved to do in this area, is we love to drive around and look at different beautiful houses in historic neighborhoods. And I remember growing up in the Charlotte area, and we drive down different roads in Charlotte near Uptown and different historic neighborhoods and beautiful houses. Same in Raleigh when we lived there. And then coming over here, and we love driving around West End and Buena Vista and all those. And you see these beautiful houses and architectural design. Amazing, amazing. Last year, Brittany shot a wedding at Grayland Estate. And before we even knew we were moving over here, or I knew anything about this church, I went with her to help her at that wedding. And I thought, I cannot believe I've lived my entire life in this state and I've never heard of this place, because it is one of the most beautiful houses I've ever seen. Incredible, beautiful. And, when you drive past a house like that, though, one of the things that you think is, I wonder who built that house. I wonder who designed that house. What's the history of it? And you see, the point here is that the house itself is not so much glorious in itself, is that every house, every building points to the architect of the house. It points to the builder of the house. The creation points to the creator. That's what I'm saying this morning. And that's what the author here is saying. Notice in verse 4, for every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. This morning, behind every human effort to build is God's effort to build. And when you think of God, I want you to think of this. Again, our kids, they learned all types of things. God's a protector, God's a shepherd, God's the promise keeper, all these things. But I want you to think that in this text that God's a builder. He's a builder. God, the builder. Not Bob the builder, but God the builder. All right? Think about that. I'll let myself out. Sorry. Dad jokes come with the territory. God the builder. Jesus is the builder of the house. He's the master architect of our faith. He's responsible for growing the community of people who gather in His name. I want you to know that God's responsible for growing this church. He is. There's human effort involved. We are builders. We'll do our part. There's strategy involved. There's a lot involved. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of work involved. But behind anything that we build, it is God building. And let me just prove it to you. We would not be here this morning. We would not have a church if it were not first for the initiative of God. We take that for granted because churches have always existed as long as any of us have been alive. But without Jesus, friend, there is no church. There is no church. And there is certainly nothing on which to build. Without Jesus, the church is just another organization, not a living organism. God is a builder. Psalm 127 verse 1 says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. And let me just say this morning that the divine builder outshines any human builder. Moses was important. He was a great builder, but the great Moses points to the far greater Jesus. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that the goat of Israel's history points to the Lamb, and the Lamb is Jesus. Superior person. Secondly, Jesus has a superior position. Notice in verse 5. It says here, now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were being spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. Moses was a servant in the house, meaning he served God's people well. But Jesus is a son over the house, meaning he has authority over God's people. The main difference here is that Moses was part of the house. Jesus is over the house. And we quickly realize this morning that when you compare Jesus to Moses, what this is that there is a categorical difference. You say, you mean when you compare Jesus to Moses, it's almost like comparing apples with oranges. No. I'm saying when you compare Jesus to Moses, it's almost like comparing apples with an apple tree. They're completely different. It is the creation and the creator. It's been noted that this is not just a quantitative difference, but it's a qualitative difference. Jesus is superior to Moses. And because of this, Jesus is worthy of our worship. Look, we don't gather this morning to worship angels. We don't gather this morning to worship legendary figures in history like Moses. We gather to worship Jesus. Why? Because only Jesus is worthy of our worship. And so the takeaway under the second point here this morning is to make room to worship Jesus. Worship Jesus. Third and finally, I want you to notice the condition as we conclude this morning. The condition. He says here at the end of verse 6, and we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Notice that plural noun there, we. We. This is not just the we in this church. This is the W-E, we in this church, our church this morning. We, as God's people, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. We are God's house. Listen, you are part of God's house. And let me, again, park here for just a second. Again, the church is not a building. It's not a building. It can be confusing because in the Bible, when we talk about God's house, there's different things. This past week in Psalm 23, verse 6, I was talking with our kids, and we were talking about, in verse 6, David says, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Well, that's talking about heaven. That's God's house, okay? Again, sometimes when we talk about God's house, we think of the building here. But God's house is not a building. It's God's people. That's you, that's me, and that's people in this community who aren't here yet. Look, I love, again, beautiful architecture. I do. And we have a beautiful building here. We have a beautiful building. I was just talking to a guy this week who tried to plant a church in another part of a different state, actually, not far from here. And he was telling me they tried to plant a church, and it really never got off the ground because they could never find a building. God has blessed our church with a beautiful building, okay? And I want to even enhance what God has already given us here. But let me just say this. I never want to lose sight of the fact that God cares more about the people in our building than this building itself. Absolutely. I've seen healthy churches, gospel-centered movements, pack out a rundown, abandoned warehouse. They'll meet in a living room, they'll meet in a park, they'll meet wherever they can find space. Why? Because the church that Jesus died for is not about having a beautiful building. It's about building beautiful people. That's the difference. And if we're not building people, this nice building that we have will eventually become empty. We are here this morning to build people. People are the mission. That's our focus. We're here to build people. And evidently, that's what God's about too. God, the Bible says, is the builder of the house. What is a house again? That's you and me. That's people. We are here to build people. That means God wants us to grow beyond where we are now. But there's a condition. I want you to notice here, he says at the end of verse 6 here, he says, if indeed we hold fast our confidence. If we hold fast to our confidence and our hope in Jesus. This doesn't mean you can lose your salvation this morning, but it's imperative to ask yourself this: where am I getting my confidence from today? Where? Where am I looking for fulfillment in life today? Is it in Jesus or is it in something else? Maybe you've trusted in Jesus when you were younger and you had nothing. But now you've grown a little bit, you make a little bit more money. Maybe you have a degree now. Maybe you've tasted a little bit more success. And you're no longer dependent on Jesus like you once were. Ask yourself this morning by way of reflection and inspection of your own heart. Do I get my confidence from my job? Do I get my confidence or fulfillment from money or possessions? Does my confidence come from my education? Does my confidence come from my social status? And put whatever you want on the list there. Because all of those things that I just mentioned this morning are fragile. They're fragile. And they can go away just like that. If we experience another recession, think about back to 2008. We went through a recession. People lost jobs. People lost money. All of those things can go away. Selling their houses. The housing market collapsed, right? In a blink of an eye, you can lose all of it. Are you building your foundation on your possessions? Or maybe you get some type of illness and you lose your intellect, or maybe the degree that you earn loses its value. What I'm saying this morning is the question that you have to ask yourself is this: am I confident because I have something or because someone has me? Am I confident because I have something or because someone has me? And that's the difference between someone who is building their lives on the sand versus someone who's building their lives on the solid rock. Are you building your life on the firm foundation of Jesus Christ? Herschel York says the only evidence of genuine faith is that it is always moving forward. So let me encourage you this morning, wherever you are in your walk with Jesus, maybe you are one time walking with Jesus and you're no longer doing that. Maybe you've never began a walk with Jesus and you'd like to begin that. But wherever you are, what I want to encourage you to do this morning is just take that next step towards Jesus. Maybe you're a seasoned Christian and you've been a Christian for a long time. Like I said earlier in the message, you can never exhaust the depths of the riches of Jesus Christ. And maybe you're here this week and you say, you know what? I'm going to take that next step and I'm going to learn more about Jesus this week. I'm going to study his life. I'm going to examine his words. I'm going to adopt his habits. Start this week. Start today. Wherever you are today, this morning in this room, my encouragement to you is this: take that next step towards Jesus, because Jesus is standing here this morning with open arms. There's a command: make time to consider Jesus. A comparison: make room to worship Jesus. And a condition: make a choice to trust Jesus.